Okay, again, good morning. Thank you so much for allowing me to spend some time with you this morning. So I want to talk a little bit about, obviously about stewardship, but I want to talk about sort of what's going on in the world, and you know, it's kind of my theme, endgame economics. It's based on some research I've done. What's actually happening in the world? How does that relate to the Bible, to prophecies, to spirituality, and of course to stewardship? That's kind of the theme of a discussion I want to talk about, take a few moments of your time this morning. So just on a time check, do I still have 45 minutes? Yes? No? Yeah?
Till 9, yeah, until 10. We will have.
I have 10, 30, 35 minutes. Oh, okay.
You can
All
go a
right.
bit,
Okay.
because
All right.
you took your time at the beginning, you can take
Okay.
too
All right, good. Okay, so I'm going to start with this guy. All right, he's been in the news all over the place. You know, and as I travel the world, people kind of ask me, you know, really, this guy, right? You know, America, what were you thinking? You know? And, you know, I'm not here to make a political statement or anything like that, but I want to help you understand maybe a little bit of background about why this happened. Okay? And I think it's important for us to understand here. So if we go back to the presidential election, which was almost a year ago, and we're still talking about, you know, should we impeach the guy or whatever, but anyways, back a year ago, we had the presidential election. And when you look at the election results, not just by state, but by county, right, the small, you know, communities that voted, you get a picture of what the election looked like. So when we look at it, you can see red would be Trump and blue would be counties that voted in favor of Clinton. And it kind of looks like this. So when you look at it that way, you go, wow, that's a pretty big landslide for the Trump administration, right? Almost the whole country is all red. And you see some of the, you know, the major metropolitan areas voted for Clinton, but the rest of the country voted for Trump. Now, because the highly populated centers, like the metropolitan centers, had more people in it, you know, Clinton ended up with more of the popular vote, but because we use a representative government in the United States and we have electoral college system, those who took all these different counties got all the votes, and so Trump actually won with quite a bit of landslide. But let's try to understand the background. Why did all of these people vote for Trump? So we go back, and in 2015, there was a study that was done by Michael Porter of Harvard University, and it was called Problems Unsolved, A Nation Divided. And it was a very interesting study that he put out, and it talked about the state of the American economy and especially of the consumers. And this is one of the charts that they had in there. And this is very fascinating and somewhat a little bit frightening here. When you look at the income level of the United States, of the American people, this is what it showed. The incomes, average income or median household income peaked in the year 2000. Okay, and it's been falling ever since, adjusted for inflation, of course. Right? So over the last 17 years, we've seen income levels falling in the United States. As a matter of fact, if we look back, and he said, you know, he said if we normalize it back to 1973, the bottom 20 percentile, right, the bottom 20% of the economy of the people have seen no income growth since 1973. Right? That's staggering. So, you know, I mean, we're talking decades of stagnation for income. Even the median income here, medium meaning the middle, is only gone up about 100% here, or sorry, not 100%, 18%, right? So that's less than 0.5% a year, right? And so, you know, you start to get the backdrop of why there's so much frustration and people wanted to change, you know, make America great again. Because they're thinking about all these years when you did see real income growth in the in the 50s and 60s, early 70s maybe. But today, the general population is struggling very much. And then you put on top of that, well, how about college tuition? Well, when I went to Andrews University, I graduated in 1985, so that kind of dates me. It was $9,000 room and board tuition to go to Andrews University, right? Today, how much does it cost to go to Andrews University? $36,000-ish, right? It's gone up 4 times, all right? 400% increase. Well, they're saying the average college tuition right now has increased since 1990 about 338%. Healthcare costs has gone up 167%. And so while incomes have stagnated, costs have continued to rise, right? And so you get this very challenging situation for most people that, economy is not doing very well, their incomes aren't rising, costs are going higher, and they're wondering what happened to the American dream, right? Where your kids will be living better than your parents, right? That was always kind of the expectation. But today we're not seeing that. Well, in terms of economic growth, we've got these people who are supposedly in charge of it, and to try and address this situation of slow economic growth, these are our central bankers, right? Yellen, Draghi, and Kuroda. And, they've pumped $13 trillion into the financial system over the last 10 years, not even 10 years, since 2009, to try and kickstart the economy, right? Has that worked? Well, apparently not for the average person. Now, this is a very telling graphic here. So, starting back in 1989, this top is the top 10% of wealth, right? So you can see what happened for them. They had about call it $20 trillion of wealth. And by 2013, that's grown threefold, right? The wealthy are doing very well. And then you got this sort of middle class, the 50 percentile to the 90th percentile. They've done a little bit better. And then there's the bottom 50%, right? Do you see this little dark line there? That's the bottom 50%. And that's actually gotten smaller down here. I think I'm in that bottom 50 percentile here. We work for the church. We're not wealthy people. But you get the picture, right? Trillions of dollars have been pumped into the financial system, but who's benefited? Only those who already had wealth, those who had assets where, when you lower interest rates and you pump that much money into the system, what happens? Well, asset prices go up. Stocks, bonds, housing, precious metals, all those kinds of things rise in value. But if you don't own a whole lot of stocks or precious metals or things like that, we're down here, right? We're on this. And so the general population is not feeling wealthier, even though the government seems to keep pushing more money into the financial system. So after many years of frustration, well, this is kind of what you get, right? You get people looking for change, hoping that somebody could fix the problems that they're living in. That's their lived experience. So, but it's really important to understand, how did we get here? How did we get to this place in our economy here? And of course, we're talking about the United States, but how does this impact the rest of the world? Because, many of you are representing other parts of the world than just the United States. So we go back to the 1940s, right? Something happened in the 1940s that was very, very crucial, and most people don't really understand it. In 1944, there was this event called the Bretton Woods Conference. Anybody know about Bretton Woods? A few of you studied it? Okay, so in 1944, just about the time that the Second World War was ending, the United States gathered together all the world leaders and said, we got to figure out how we're going to rebuild the world economy, right? Because it's just kind of been blown apart. The United States is still doing relatively well because they hadn't experienced war on their own soil, but the rest of the world's sort of blown to smithereens. So they gathered everybody together there, and most of the world leaders were kind of expecting, okay, the United States is going to dictate terms. They're going to say, okay, you guys need to pay this and that, and that's typically how colonization worked, right? Everybody was sort of expecting the United States to say, okay, here's our terms. And they did something very, very different. Instead of saying, okay, you guys need to give us money, the United States said, well, okay, we're going to pay to help rebuild the world, right? We're going to loan you money. We're going to give you, the Marshall Plan. We've got all these plans to help rebuild the world, right? And everybody said, well, this sounds great, right? There was only one catch. What was the catch? The United States dollar was going to become the reserve currency for the world, right? All the commodity transactions, world trade, everything was going to be done in US dollars. And US dollars was going to be used as a reserve currency. That means when you made money, when countries had surpluses, where were they going to hold it? In US dollars, right? US dollars, US Treasury bonds, and so on, everything was going to be done in US dollars, right? And the world agreed to it. They signed on and said, yeah, Bretton Woods, the US dollar as reserve currency, we're all for that because you're going to help us rebuild the country, rebuild the world. And of course they said, the dollar is going to be connected to gold, right? And so you don't have to worry that, you've got dollars because it's backed by gold, right? Right? For every ounce of gold, for $33 for every ounce of gold. That was kind of the going rate. So the world signed on, and as we saw over the from the 1950s and 60s, the world economy did get rebuilt. And they did do a very good job of rebuilding the war-torn countries and so on. So I want to show you kind of what happened in the world economy. So we're going to look at the US stock market, right, as a representation for the economy, US economy. And this sort of helps understand what happened here. So this is the 100-year chart for the US stock market. And you can see that, if you just kind of look at it, you go, oh, okay, yeah, it kind of went up with some ups and downs. But if you break it down, it really shows you the eras that we had in the United States and really the global economy. So in the 1920s to 45, during the Great Depression era and the World Wars, we saw the stock market kind of go sideways, right? You had the Great Depression and the echo and so on. You started investing here, you came here, and did you make any money? Not really. We got a lot of ups and downs, but you came here and you were sort of at the same spot where you started, right? That makes sense? Okay, well, look what happened after World War II. The stock market had a tremendous surge, right? Particularly the United States, because the rest of the world was kind of blown up. And so the United States economy did really, really well, and so did the stock market, right? Kept growing. And the US monetary policy, US dollar kept being pumped into the global system, and everything was doing really, really well. But then what happened in the 1970s and 80s, or 1960s and 70s? Well, you can see again that kind of the stock market sort of went sideways, right? What happened during that era? Well, if you recall, some of you, I see enough gray hair that you probably remember, some of you who were around, there was this thing called the Arab oil crisis, and they had what we called stagflation. It was an era where things started to get more expensive, but the economy was slowing down. It wasn't really growing the way it had been growing over the last 20 years. Well, what made the difference? What was the problem? Well, the problem was the US dollar was tied to gold, right? And the US was running out of gold. We didn't have enough gold to fund all of this continued expansion. So in 1971, we had a president called President Nixon, and he made a decision. He said, well, we're going to end this convertibility of dollars to gold. So US dollars were no longer going to be tied to amount of gold that we had, right? Well, what did that allow us to do? It allowed us to print more money, right? And it took a while because the 70s were a little bit rough, right? We had a lot of different things going on in the economy, and we had the oil crisis and all that kind of stuff, high inflation. But eventually, all of that free credit, no, I shouldn't say free credit, but easy credit started to kick in. And look what happened in the 80s and 90s, right? The economy and the stock market took off, really strongly over the next 20 years, right? Well, then we hit another bump in the road. In the year 2000, what happened? Well, we had the big stock market crash, right? The technology bubble burst because we were running into a little bit of a problem around the growth in the economy versus, the growth in the stock market versus what was really growth in the economy. And then we entered into this period of sort of a bubble economy, right? We had a stock market crash, we had the real estate bubble, we had another crash, and here we are at all-time highs again, and everybody's again worried about, maybe there's another crash coming. Well, important to think about here is what really drove that growth, right? So this dark line I just showed you here represents the amount of debt that the United States has. So in the year 1980, U.S. had $5 trillion in debt. Okay, that's total debt. That's including government, business, and individual. $5 trillion, right? Remember we said somewhere around here, we took the lid off of the gold standard, right? So we didn't need any more gold to print more money. And so from here to here, we went up from 5 trillion to 30 trillion. We added $25 trillion of debt to help fund this growth in the economy, right? Well, we didn't stop there. We got into this bubble economy, and in order to try and fix this economy, what did we do? We pumped more money into the system. Another $30 trillion we added, and still we're getting this bubble economy, right? And so we have to wonder, if we get another stock market crash, right, and we're down to here, we pumped $30 trillion into the economy, and what did we get? Just a lot more debt, right? Okay, but I want to go back here and think about, this wasn't just an economic thing. There was a transformation of the U.S. economy and society that happened. And we really want to think about and understand that. Okay, so in the 1970s, we got this little piece of plastic started to become very popular, right? Did anybody have one of these? Bank AmeriCard? Some of you guys remember that? Did you have one of those? Okay, that was one of the very first credit cards that were made available, right? Each bank was issuing these credit cards. Well, now, there's so many different credit cards out there. You got MasterCard, you got Visa, you got, American Express, Diner. Like, my kids have more credit cards than I do, there's so much easy credit available out there. And that really started to change the way society worked and the way we spent our money and how we lived our lives, right? Well, the other thing that happened in the 80s was something called globalization, right? So companies were looking for ways to make more money, to become more profitable. Labor was getting very expensive. And so they said, oh, well, you know what we're going to do? We're going to send all of this labor, and we're going to send it to places like Japan and China and Korea and all these other places that had cheap labor, right? And that made companies very much more profitable. But what did it do to the individual? Well, people who were working in good manufacturing jobs, they lost those jobs, and they weren't able to find other jobs. And so they had to go into different industries like the service industry, which didn't pay as well, right? And this really started to transform the country from a manufacturing nation into a consumer-driven nation. And we see that transformation happening now in other countries as well, not just the United States. Even China now, right? They're starting to outsource their labor costs to where? To Africa, because it's starting to get expensive for Chinese companies to hire Chinese workers. And so they're offshoring their business. But that has a fundamental impact on individuals and the economy and how much money we're making, right? Because remember, in my parents' age and older, one husband, right, or one income earner could earn enough money to pay for the family, to pay for the house, retirement, college tuition, all those kinds of things, right? And still have a little bit left over. But today, it takes two people working really hard all the time, and you still seems like you can't hardly make ends meet. Another thing happened in the 80s. I don't know if any of you remember this. That was one of my first computers I ever used, right? It was the Radio Shack TRS-80. I don't know if anybody remembers those. I learned on that. It was back in, when I was in Kingsway College and Academy, and we got a couple of these, and we were really excited about these computers. But did that change? Did that transform the economy and society? Tremendously, right? I mean, economically, now you're using a spreadsheet and stuff, one person could do the job of 3 or 4 people, right? And it fundamentally changed our economy, and we became much more efficient. But again, a lot of people lost those good jobs that they used to have, and they were forced into retraining and doing things that were, more service-oriented and perhaps less wealth, what's the word I'm looking for? Basically they were making less money. What was the next thing? Another transformation that happened was women in the workforce, right? In the 60s and 70s, we did have ladies in the workforce, but in the 80s, that really, really changed, right? We had so many more women going into the workforce. And I'm not against that at all or anything like that, but it did change. Did that not change our society? When instead of having one parent at home looking after the kids and raising them, now both parents were off working, the kids were off to daycare. It changed the way our society is, right? And of course, the other thing was that we talked about earlier, as we continue to pump more money into the system, as debts increased, the values of things particularly like housing, continue to rise faster than our incomes. So housing costs for things like cars, healthcare, tuition, all those kinds of things started rising. And they were rising much faster than our incomes. And as you saw, especially for the bottom 20 percentile, right, they were not keeping up at all. How did that affect the families? Well, we all know that one of the biggest challenges that most families face is financial. Right? The causes of many divorces happens to be around financial issues. It's caused a large increase in the divorce rate, and I don't know if anybody's actually done an empirical study around finances and divorce rate, but I think they are related. Another interesting thing was, somebody did a study and they said during bad times fewer babies are born, and you can see the birth rates have dramatically fallen over the last 100 years or so. And particularly, you can see the impact of depressions and bad economic environments on babies being born. Of course, the challenge, the change in the nuclear family has brought about a lot of other societal transformations, right? The breakdown of family, and now you've got people, gender identity issues. I think you can all trace that back to this breakdown in the family structure. Of course, people are working more. Church attendance is dropping, and people are tired. You know, they're working long hours, and church attendance is not a priority in a lot of families anymore. You know, and we think about the words of the prophet Haggai, who said, "You've sown much and you bring in little. You eat, but you do not have enough. You drink, but you're not filled with drink. You clothe yourself, but no one is warm. And he who earns wages to put into a bag with holes." And, you know, I think it's a great description of the society that we're living in today. We seem to be chasing wealth and chasing prosperity, but never really finding that sort of happiness that we were longing for. But this wasn't just the United States either, right? So, you know, when we think about the global economy and this globalization, all of that debt that we just talked about, $60 trillion in debt we've added to the global economy, that didn't just sit in the United States, right? Because of globalization and offshoring of work and everything, all of that money found other places to go. And if you think about, you know, how society, how countries have been transformed, you know, you think about Tokyo and China. Here's Bangkok over here. I was just in Bangkok, a huge, you know, very huge metropolitan area. Little pop quiz here. What's this country here? What city is this? Anyone know? I'm looking at you, Penny.
Yeah, he's looking familiar.
It's Johannesburg. There you go. Come on. All right, what about this one? Well, so, this one. Anyone know this one? What's that one? Huh? Any guesses?
Kuala Lumpur?
Right area. Right area. That's Mumbai.
Okay.
That's Mumbai. This one. Come on, Marcos. There you go. Right? The world is transformed and has become much more modern and hustling, bustling metropolitan centers. Tremendous amount of debt has been expended to get to this place, right? We've seen lots of economic growth, but that's largely driven by debt. So let's talk about the problem of debt. I still have a few minutes. You know, interesting in the book of Habakkuk, he says a kind of an interesting thing here. He says, indeed, he was prophesying, right? He's prophesying about Babylon. He says, indeed, he transgresses by wine. He's a proud man. He doesn't stay at home. He enlarges his desires, hell, and he's like death. He can't be satisfied. He gathers up to himself all nations and all people, nations, and heaps up to himself all peoples. That's an interesting description of a nation, isn't it? That this nation that tries to gather all these other nations and they can't be satisfied. You know, he goes on to say, woe to him who increases that which is not his. How long? And to him that loads himself with many pledges. Now, when I read that, I thought that's a really good, you know, description of our society today. Woe to him who increases that which is not his, right? Why is it not his? You know, we've got more stuff, but it doesn't belong to us. Why? Because we've increased many debts, right? Well, what does the prophet say? He says, will not your creditors rise up suddenly? Will they awaken who oppress you, and you will become their booty? Now, interestingly enough, of course, Babylon never succumbed to a debt crisis. They were taken over by Medo-Persia. So you just wonder, you know, who was Habakkuk talking about? And was this intended for another audience, a different Babylon? You know, but if you think about the problem of debt, here it is. You know, we just saw this national debt that we were talking about. You know, in the year 2000, we really saw an exponential ramp up of debts, right? And the problem is this, is that in the early stages of debt growth, you know, you utilize debt, national debt, to try and get economic growth. And it works for a certain point in time. But then what happens is you need more debt just to help get some more growth, but also to service the existing debt. And then you get to this kind of terminal phase where you just need more debt to pay off the old debt, right? And that's kind of where we're at today. We just keep adding more debt in order to keep keep servicing the old debt. And that's where we're at. So now, does the Bible have anything more to say about this situation here? I'm going to turn to the book of Revelation. And, we know about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. It kind of represents the early stage of the church. We had the white horse, which represented the early church, the red horse, which was the persecuted church, the black horse, which was the compromising church, and then we had the Dark Ages, right? So I want to kind of focus on this guy here, right here, this black horse. Well, what is that black horse? Well, if we go to Revelation chapter 6, and he said, when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, come and see. And behold, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts say, a measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. So let's try to understand this statement here and break it down a little bit. So there's this black horse, a rider on it had a pair of balances in his hand, and you hear this voice out of the midst of the four beasts, so that's the voice of God saying, a measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. So when we look at it, the black horse represents corruption, and the balances represent money or commerce, which was sort of the interests of the leadership in those days, right? Because this is representing the 3rd and 4th century BC, AD of the early church. So our church leaders have become corrupt, and they were interested more in money and power in those days than the work of the gospel. Well, this measure of wheat and 3 measures of barley, most commentators talk about that it's just representing a certain amount of wheat, but John Wesley in his commentary said, that actually represents a specific amount, right? And he said that's a slave's portion for a day. Used in that context, a measure of wheat and 3 measures of barley, that represents what a slave got as a daily ration in those days, right? And so, enough wheat or barley, which was an inferior grain, to make a small loaf of bread for them, right? And then the penny or a denarius was a daily wage for a skilled worker. So, you kind of put us all together and you say, well, for a slave's portion, you got to work all day to get a slave's portion, right? Kind of if you will, a very high cost of living or a hyperinflationary kind of a scenario. Well, then the question is, did that actually happen, right? Because this was talking about the 3rd century, 4th century BC. So, the question is, did that actually happen? And I don't know why that's coming up. Let me get rid of that. Okay. Access denied. All right, let me just stop this for a second. Go away. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so we go back, and if you look at history, now archaeologists have dug up records, and there's a lot of interest in Roman history these days, and they uncovered history or archaeological records of the cost of wheat. Now, Rome used to import a lot of wheat from Egypt, right? Because Egypt was very fertile, right around the Nile Delta. It was very, very good for growing, and Rome needed to have lots of agricultural goods. So they used to ship almost 1/3 of their annual supply was bought from Egypt, and they would ship it over by boat to Rome, right? And of course, they paid for it in Roman coins. But a very interesting thing happened. As the archaeologists looked at the history of the cost of wheat, well, it looked kind of like this. So this goes back to the time of Christ. This is 18 AD, BC. and goes all the way here to about 300 AD, right? So you see the price of wheat. Throughout that time period, right, price of wheat was pretty steady, right? Not much change in the price of wheat. But what happened here? We found that around the late 3rd century, right, around 270 AD, the price of wheat started to take off. And then by the time we hit 300 AD, right, we had this huge spike, about 24,000 times increase in the price of wheat. Well, how did that happen? Why did that happen? Well, if you think about kind of what was going on in this era, the Romans were expanding their empire, right? They were going to the east towards India. They were going up into Europe and so on, and so they required a lot of soldiers to expand their borders. At the same time, they were getting attacked by these barbarian hordes, right? Attila the Hun and these guys were coming and attacking the nation, and so they needed lots of soldiers. And at this point in time, they said there was about 60 legions of soldiers in the Roman army. So that's about 600,000 soldiers. Well, of course, they all need to get paid, you know, and it's expensive. And as the work got more dangerous, right, they were demanding more and more money. And the generals were corrupt, and they had lots of power and influence, and so they got more money. Well, how do you pay for that? How did the Roman Empire pay for it? Well, you know, they had so much gold and so much wealth, but they were starting to run out. So right around this time, there was an emperor named Diocletian. He said, okay, well, we got an economic problem here, right? Because we can't afford all the 60 legions of armies that we have. So what did he do? Well, he repatriated all of the silver denarius, the silver coins that were in circulation. He took them all back, and he minted new ones, which were silver-plated coins, right? So instead of the original silver denarius, which was a pure silver coin, he started to take a piece of brass and cover it with silver, right? Silver-plated coin. Now, at first, it was only a small bit of brass with mostly silver, but by the time we got around to the end of that century here, down to around 300 AD, it was only about 0.5% silver, right? Mostly this brass plug with this very thin coating of silver, right? Monetary debasement, right? They devalued that denarius almost 100%. Well, you know, the average person didn't have a lot of economic power, so they had to say, okay, well, we'll accept those denarius. But the Egyptian wheat traders obviously were not stupid, and they were saying, okay, this isn't really a silver denarius like it used to be, right? It's a silver-plated coin. It's like barely any silver on it, so they demanded more and more and more silver for the price of wheat. And so we can see that the price of wheat started to ratchet higher and higher and higher until eventually, you know, when you got 0.5% of silver, what happened, right? So by the time we hit about 300 AD, the price of wheat skyrocketed, right? A measure of wheat for a penny, 3 measures of barley for a penny. Well, do we recall from history what happened after this? What happened in the early 4th century, right? Again, the Roman Empire was under siege. They were being attacked by barbarian hordes. The country was sort of splitting down the middle. You have pagans on this side. You had all these Christians. And so what did this new emperor do? Constantine came in and said, oh, by the way, I'm a Christian, right? I'm a Christian now. He tried to unite the country by declaring that Christianity was legal. And there, from that point on, we had, the church leaders, the bishops of Rome and so on, started to gain more and more power and wealth and position and so on. So you can see kind of the history of what happened here through the first 3 centuries in our early church, and exactly as the prophecy had talked about, right? Interestingly enough, if you overlay modern history and you look at the historical results of inflation, inflation is actually a fairly modern phenomenon, right? If you look at the first 200 or so years of American history, there's not much inflation there, right? But as soon as you got central banking and all this stuff in the modern financial system, you know, all the central banks, what do they want? They all talk about inflation targeting, right? They want inflation as if inflation is a good thing. And here we are as our inflationary costs ramp up. So what does that mean for us today? Higher cost of inflation. You know, I did look into Ellen White's writings and said, you know, is there anything that she had to say? And this is the only specific reference I found to Revelation 6. She said in a letter, she said, the same Spirit is seen today that is represented in Revelation 6:6-8. History is to be repeated. That which has been will be again. And I found that to be very fascinating when we think about where we were in history and where we are today in terms of inflation and where we're headed. You know, the central banks are so determined to create more inflation. Today, we've added another, like I said, $57 trillion in debt since the great financial crisis. This is 2014, we're actually around $227 trillion in global debt at this point in time and counting. So, you know, hyperinflation, is this saying that we're going to see a hyperinflationary scenario again? Perhaps. One thing for sure right now, we know that you can't get a hyperinflationary scenario with the US dollar because the US dollar is so crucial to the global economy, right? 40% of global payments are done in US dollars. As far as reserve currencies, 64% of global reserve currencies is in US dollars. So until something like that changes and people turn away from the US dollar and start holding euros or yuan or other currencies, we're not going to see that kind of hyperinflationary scenario. But you can already see some of those movements starting to take place and the preferences changing in the world. I got to move more quickly now. Let's think about inflation for a second, though, okay? Because, you know, you keep hearing, oh, there's no inflation or inflation is very low, right? Is that what you hear in the news? Now, there's some countries where there is a little bit higher inflation. Brazil has a little bit higher inflation and so on. But in most of the developed economies, you know, we have like very low, less than 2%. At least that's what we report, right? So inflation, you know, consumer price index, which is how they measure inflation, is a basket of goods, right? So you got your house, you got transportation costs, food, clothing, education, all these different things make up inflation. And what the government does is says, well, okay, we'll take a bit of this, and we'll take a bit of this, and this, and this, and they sort of make this proportional calculation of said, you know, the average person consumes, you know, 10% of their costs is healthcare, and housing costs represent 30%. You know, they make up what they think the average person looks like, right? And then they got some luxury goods and vacations, all these kinds of things. And they say, oh, well, when you add all those things together, well, we only get like 2% inflation, right? But as we saw earlier, things like college tuition and healthcare, transportation, those other things are starting to cost a lot more money. So what if I'm the average Joe and I don't get to do luxury vacations and I can't buy that Rolex and flat screen TV and I don't buy these expensive clothes and, you know, housing, my house, I lost my house, so I don't have any housing costs there, or I'm renting. when you start to break it down to the average person who doesn't have all those expensive things, right? What happens to inflation then? Right? The average person is spending more money on the things that are very expensive, right? Tuition, food, healthcare. So the average person, their lived experience, when they look at your own personal CPI, right? Way higher, way higher. And so, you know, when the government keeps going, oh, we want to create inflation, and keep pouring more money into the system, the average person, they're not seeing the benefit of that by rising asset prices, but they're certainly getting impacted because of the unintended consequences that has on inflation and so on. Okay, so let me, do I have 5 more minutes?
Yeah.
A few more minutes? Okay, so let's bring it back now to stewardship, right? Because you guys are in charge of stewardships. So we see the challenges in front of the average citizen who's trying to earn and take care of their family and so on. When we look at demographics, this is what we see, okay? So, you know, this is the different age groups. So we have what they call the older gen or great gen, which is kind of the really old people. I don't think any of you fall into that category yet. That's 80. Anybody over 80 yet? No? Nobody here? Okay. Maybe you want to. And then we have what they call the silent gen or the gray gen, which is here, the older generation. We have the baby boomers here, right? This is that big baby boomer group. We have Gen X, we have the millennials, and we have the Gen Z. Okay? And this is sort of the distribution of the US population according to those different generations. Now, when you think about, when we look at it, I don't know if did everybody get this book?
Yes.
Everybody's got this book, right? So when I looked at that book and you looked at the tithing practices of, well, I'm going to pick on the Californians. Anybody from California? I don't mean to pick on you. But, okay, so the oldest generation here, about 66% of our church members are tithe payers, okay? And then as we move down into the silent gen, we got 61%. Right now, our study doesn't line up exactly with these age groups, so there's going to be a little bit off. The next group, which is kind of the tip of the baby boomers, the 50 to 59-year-olds, they're about 49% of them are tithe payers. And then you get down towards the early part. This is my generation here, around the, I think I missed. This is the 60 to 69-year-olds, and then this is the 50 to 59-year-olds here, right? I'm somewhere in there. 41% are faithful tithe payers. And then you get into, then you see this huge drop-off, right? You get into the Gen X, and you see this big drop-off, 33%, and then the kind of the gap, spanning the gap between the millennials and the Gen X, you got 27% in the early Gen X. Well, a lot of those are still in college, and they're down to 13% here, right? You know, when we talk about stewardship and we think about the messaging and how we want to relate to people about stewardship, it matters which group, because you know, if you make too many blanket statements, it doesn't resonate with people, right? So, you know, let's pick on, not just pick on, but if we focus our attention on one group, and this morning I just want to focus our attention on this one group right here, sort of in the middle, right? You know, only about somewhere around 30 to 40% of faithful tithe payers here, right? Certainly can do better here, but what's the lived experience of these people? Well, you know, just a couple weeks ago, this came out from CNBC. He said 78% of full-time workers live paycheck to paycheck, right? That means you miss one paycheck, you're in big trouble. They're living paycheck to paycheck. 56% say they're in way over their heads in terms of debt and their cost of living. They can't really make things go. It's costing them a lot. housing affordability, it's never been, this is a real estate researcher, and he says it's never been more expensive to be able to afford a house. The average cost of a house at $69,000 is way above average income or median income. And it's never been that way before. It's become much more expensive to own a house. Other data here, family, this is from the Pew Research Center. Families with two parents have been dropping off since the 1960s. 87% of families had two parents. We're down to 69. This one is really frightening here. Single parent families here, right? Single mother or with the mom being the primary provider, that's gone from about 10%. Now 40% of families have the mom as the main provider. Either they're single mom or married with married, but the mom being the single provider. I mean, that's got to have an impact on the family, right? The mom's out there working really hard. And the middle class continues to shrink. So in 1970, 61% of the households were considered middle class. That's shrunk down to 50% here, with the lower incomes really starting to increase here. And I think that trend is going to continue as we see the middle class continuing to shrink. So let's think about, I keep bringing it down sort of a little bit more real to everybody here. So let's think about an average family of four, okay? Well, that's probably not the average family of four there, but that's a ready picture available. You know who that is? You see that? Yeah. It was there, so I just took that picture. But he probably makes a little bit more than this. But the average American family income, right? This is household income. This is not individual. This household income is about $60,000. That means a monthly after-tax income of about $4,500 a month. Okay? And when you tack on the cost of housing is about, with utilities included, that's about $2,200 a month, right? You take the cost of transportation, one car, maybe some transit costs, $800 a month. Food, $600. I'm just using some averages here that's available. Telecom, communications, entertainment, $250. Just clothing and essentials. And then if you've got any school loans, you add those up, and how much are you left with? We got about $100 left, right? But we didn't cover savings, we didn't cover retirement savings, we didn't cover health care, heaven forbid if you got sick, right? And of course, what's not in there? Tithe and offerings. And how about church school, right? How do we afford church school? Right? But that's the lived experience of the average American family today, right? Who's making $60,000 a year. I mean, that is the median income. How do we get these people to say, I'm going to give up 10, 15% of my income, right, to give tithe and offerings? It sounds like an impossible task, isn't it? And a lot of say, I even heard this Sabbath, right? Oh, you can do more with 90%, paying tithe than 100%, right? We always say that. But, you do the math and you go, okay, well, where do I take the money from, right? And that is the real experience here, because we've created a society, an economic system that we live in today where the average family, it's like almost mathematically, like, how do you do it, right? And that's a challenge that we have today. And so we could talk about, faithful tithe giving and all of that stuff, but in the back of their minds, they're going, I got $100 left over at the end of the month if I'm lucky. Most of the time, I'm using my credit card so I can afford stuff, right? And you want to tell me about tithes and offerings? Send your kids to church school? How do you do that? Right? And I think that, we need to understand the condition of the average American, and this could be, and this is not just America, this is most developed countries and even other, developing countries. I would say that they're sort of in the same boat. How do we talk to these people? How do we engage them and encourage them to become faithful tithe payers, right? And even more importantly, this is a family, right? So the husband says, okay, yeah, I'm convicted. I really think we should pay tithe, right? And he's going to go to his wife and go, I need, I need $500 to pay tithes and offerings. How do you think that conversation is going to go? Right? Probably not that well. You can use the approach, well, I'll give it and God will find a way, right? We always say that. But the reality for a lot of people is, every couple of weeks they have to make some decisions around, well, where do I put my money? Right? It's a challenge. And what we don't say in a lot of our stewardship presentation is we talk about faith and so on, but we don't say, well, how do you actually get from here, from my $100, how do we get to a place where I really can pay tithes and offerings, right? Because the reality is, every single one of these lines, somebody has to make a intentional decision to squeeze a little bit out of each one of these, right? Isn't that how? That's the only way, right? Unless God miraculously makes this line bigger, but I don't think that's not the lived experience of most people, right? We don't, the top line's not growing, right? And in some cases, we do see God will bless people and their business will thrive and so on. But for the average person, they're kind of living paycheck to paycheck on a regular income, right? We have to teach them how to squeeze a little bit out of each one of these lines, and that's not an easy thing. I don't know what happened to my... Ellen White had written to this family, said, professing Christians are not always willing to practice the self-denial that the Savior calls for. They're not willing to bind about their wishes and desires in order their desires in order that they may have more to give to the Lord. One family says, my family expenses have expensive tastes and it costs much to keep them, right? I think we're all in this kind of boat, we want to make our families happy, right? But we've trained them to have expensive tastes, or not maybe society has trained them to have expensive tastes, right? All the things, all the gadgets, all the activities, we've trained our kids to have expensive tastes. And somehow we need to pull them back from that. It's almost like impossible math, right? You've got a fixed income and short of God sort of bailing you out on a weekly basis, how do you actually get people to be wise stewards? And that's your challenge, so I'm just going to leave that with you. It's not an easy challenge, right? But to be able to speak to people at a real level and help them address their challenges, that's not easy. I'm sorry, I'm way over my time, but just 2 minutes, is okay? All right. One thing, this is my own personal experience, and you can agree or disagree, but I think one of the areas that really has potential and is important to put together with stewardship is our health message, right? How do we teach people to modify their tastes, to modify their lifestyle, to change the way they're doing things so that they can afford to give tithes and offerings, right? Because we're not expecting God to do miracles every week and change that top line. He expects us to manage the bottom line. And that's not easy. And especially if you had a family, that's not easy, right? Because you could be convicted, but what about your wife, your children, right? You know, because it really works well to tell your teenagers, oh, you can't have that, or you can't, right? How well does that go over? Yeah, like a lead balloon, you know? Oh, I've decided because we're going to be faithful stewards and tithe payers, you can't have your cell phone anymore. Yeah, you know? How well is that going to go over, right? You know, for me, as I started really thinking down this road, one of the things I changed was my health habits, right? Eating better, being more health conscious, living more simply. You know, because I was sort of in that same boat, right? You know, I was making good money, but expenses were high, you know, and so on. But we had to change that equation somehow. And the only way I found was, hey, you know what? Change has to start with me, right? The way I live, the choices I make on a daily basis, how that affects my family, my finances, and so on. And I think the health message, rightly explained and embraced, can really influence a family and change the way that, change our tastes. Because until we get to that, right, we can demand all we want, but we're not going to influence our families. And so I think there's a really strong combination here that we can make in helping families to get to a point where they can be better stewards. You know, I think it's very, I don't know if it's ironic or indicative that, you know, today we have such financial struggles in most houses. At the same time, obesity is a huge epidemic, right? How do those two things go together? So, you know, you guys are the stewardship experts. I only have the experience of my own family here, but I do really believe that there's a connection here, right? And there's a way that we need to approach our members, our families, in a way that, you know, the typical stewardship sermon is, you know, oh, God will find a way if you pay your faithful tithe. But we don't really teach them how to become more faithful stewards, how to change the tastes of your family, how to influence them so that we can be faithful stewards. Because I think stewardship is not about God adjusting the top line, but it's about us adjusting the bottom line. And that's not easy. I've taken way more time than I was supposed to, and I apologize for that. But you know, I hope this has been helpful. You know, I think about Lot and his wife, right? You can. Well, I guess I was going to say you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Maybe it's quite the opposite here. You can take the woman out of Sodom, but where her heart is, that's where her treasure is, right? We have to go down this path of stewardship, but we need to take our families with us. We can't rush down this road on our own. We've got to gather our families and coach them and wean them and help them to become better stewards along with us. And I hope that, you know, we can craft a message and create stewardship programs that can do just that, and not just talk about, well, you know, if we give our tithe, you know, somehow God's going to increase our top line, because I don't think that's a reality for most people. It's about how we manage that bottom line for our families. Anyways, thank you so much for your time, and I hope that's been helpful, and I wish you the best, because what you're doing has such an impact on our church, not just from a financial perspective, but from a spiritual perspective, and how we you know, get our families out of this materialistic society that's conditioned us to live expensively into a world where we're good stewards for God. And thank you very much.